Throughout human history, oppressed people have revolted against political and economic systems to gain equality and the rights that all autonomous persons deserve. In theory, America was founded on that principle that all human beings are created equal and with inherent rights. Oppressed people, through nonviolent means, have often demanded and won rights and conditions denied them by unequal systems. As a result, the political systems associated with the oppressed groups passed laws and new legislation to ensure equality and basic human rights. From that point, the disenfranchised group should have the same rights as the system's enfranchised population and be treated equally by law. However, the reality of these situations rarely end in equality for all. If the structure is not systematically changed or transformed by revolution or legislation, then a true power shift for equality does not really occur. Often, the structure only provides enough rights to placate the group, and eventually this false placation ends up in violence like genocide. This brief exploratory essay will examine the true nature of this type of placation and will offer a conceptual framework which indicates that false generosity from the system is a precondition for structural violence, and if not addressed, fosters an infectious, violent environment. This framework is outlined by an exploration of different definitions of structural violence in relationship to the notion of placation among oppressed and revolting groups. Then connects Ferreira's definition of false generosity as a precondition to structural violence, and then finally examines the relationship between structural violence and false generosity in terms of genocide prevention. Structural violence. Let's look at that. So to begin, a definition of both violence and structural violence is needed. Galtung states, violence is that which increases the distance between the potential and the actual, and that which impedes the decrease of this distance. This is a basic understanding of violence. When a violent action occurs to an individual or from an individual, there is a point in which the potentiality of the individual becomes limited. Thus, creating violence prevents an individual from utilizing their individual capability and places the individual at a disadvantage among those who are not affected by the violence. In some cases, depending on the level and type of violence, the potential may cease to exist altogether and result in death. Also part of Galtung's definition is the creation of other. The act of violence makes a clear distinction between perpetrator and victim. Insofar, the victim has a clear limitation on potentiality, and the perpetrator is the one who limits the potentiality. Structural violence limits the potential of individuals on a large scale, even when the violence is associated with a single perpetrator. Galtung summarizes this idea by stating, there may not be any person who directly harms another person in the structure. The violence is built into the structure and shows up as unequal power and consequently as unequal life chances. So instead of individuals becoming violent, the historical socio-political structure or system becomes violent. This type of structure creates a systemic process of violence, which prevents groups of people from not only reaching their potential, but also prohibits access to basic needs. Gill describes structural violence as a violence which involves the establishment and maintenance of multidimensional inequalities, i.e., conditions of social justice that inhibit the development of individuals, social groups, and people by interfering with fulfillment of their inherent human needs. The inequalities are evident in discrimination based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and place a certain population at a vast disadvantage from the group in power. This type of violence centers on habitual inequalities which becomes instituted into the social structure. Galtung states a steep gradient is then constructed, inflated, even exalting the value of self, deflating, and even debasing the value of other. At that point, structural violence can start operating. So then again, as in the initial definition of violence, a clear distinction between victim and perpetrator is made. But in this case, violence is evident in direct physical manifestations and also in mental and psychological manifestations. Human rights scholar Ho continues the needs deficit argument generated by structural violence by associating structural violence with human rights violations. She states when economic and social structures conspire to limit one's agency to the extent that fundamental needs cannot be met, then structural violence becomes a structural violation of human rights. Structural violence must be recognized as a human rights violation in order to transform the violent structure completely and have optimum outcomes. This point is essential when examining placation of revolutionary or oppressed groups. If the system or structure is not changed, transformed, or deconstructed by the disadvantaged group, then there will be consistent, continuous human rights violations, and a new structurally violent system will take root in society. One example is after the civil rights movement, African Americans were finally given the same access to participate in the voting process. However, the all-white legislation locally and nationally used gerrymandering to ensure largely African American populated areas were split up to ensure less political power. If a system of structural violence continues, the violence becomes cyclical and has physical and psychological manifestations and results in trauma. Galtung states, "Violent structure leaves marks not only on the human body, but also on the mind and the spirit." This type of violence often leaves people void of dignity and respect, which creates situations where irrational ideas and actions become rational. Structural violence and transgenerational trauma are interconnected and can produce a dysfunctional system where the individual or group feel as though they can never escape or gain power. This dysfunctional system can be transmitted from generation to generation. In essence, a people's history becomes their psychology, and their psychology, past and present, is burdened by their history. This is another mechanism in which a whole population of people become victims of violence and can never really reach their full potential. Oftentimes, this type of trauma begins to generate a divide and conquer mentality among the disenfranchised group. Since the structure keeps the enfranchised group in power, the structure is meant to perpetuate violence among the disenfranchised groups by means of bigotry and ignorance. For example, in America, there's a large, low socioeconomic class which defies racial lines. However, due to the structurally classist and racist system, the members of this group are often pitted against each other politically or economically. As a result, the emphasis on the parallel characteristics and causes of oppression and disenfranchisement is deflected or negated, which helps the oppressive class remain as oppressors. If the oppressed groups united and worked as one force with common issues, a structural change can easily be managed. The relationship between structural violence and transgenerational violence is such a complicated and deep connection that individuals are completely unaware of not only the perpetrator, but also the violence occurring in their daily lives. These are important concepts to understand in relation to placation of revolutionary groups, because this puts a great deal of responsibility on the new structure to deconstruct and dismantle the trauma generated by previous oppressive structures. One method in which this could occur is by deconstructing history among the powerful and the powerless. This reconstruction process will call upon recognition of injustice by those who are in power and acknowledgement of how this injustice impacted the powerless. This point is crucial because if a government is creating laws and a new structure in which to ensure equality for the oppressed group, there must be a period of acknowledgement and history deconstruction, which tells a narrative that fully supports the oppressed group and for the structure to be fully changed and devoid of violence. One final point, Sartre states, generosity then is a feeling structured by the existence of the other and indicates a preference for appropriation by destruction. This notion creates a division among groups and thereby always creates an other, so regardless of what is given, there will never be a unified group. There will always be a powerful and a powerless. One last way to understand false generosity is understand true generosity. Although Sartre believes all generosity is false, we are not obligated to one another, Freire disagrees. He says true generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals as an entire people, need to be extended less and less in supplication, so that more and more they become human hands which work and working transform the world. True generosity means justice. There is no more notion of giving what is an excess or what a group can afford to give, but instead working towards ensuring all groups have their basic needs met. This means that This means that rights cannot just be given through an excess from a government of oppressors to a group of oppressed individuals, but must be given equitable, and the oppressed must have a voice in the authority which enforces the rights. Finally, making the connection between false generosity and structural violence is simple. The definition of structural violence given and its concepts demonstrate that a truly changed structure must incorporate true generosity. However, history indicates that structures never really change. Instead, the oppressors, or the haves, give falsely generous rights to placate the revolting groups in order to once again ensure the violent structure. So false generosity can be seen as a precondition to structural violence. The difficulty in truly assessing the precondition is typically the system or structure in question is already violent. Due to this context of the specific precondition is always during a time of possible system transformation and construction. Understanding this precondition is vital to the enormity of change which must occur in the structure in order to move away from violence. Like mentioned before, the only way in which to defeat structural violence is to make certain true generosity is taking place. This means that rights and equality cannot just be put in effect. The history of inequality must be deconstructed by both the haves and the have-nots. There must be a period of history deconstruction in order to generate a new structure which no longer creates an us versus them mentality, but rather a we mentality. This is just the first step in truly working towards structural change. So what does this mean in terms of genocide prevention? Now that a connection has been established between false generosity and structural violence, there are some implications to be made on violence prevention. One of the purposes of recognizing this precondition of false generosity and structural violence is to apply this to violence prevention, in particular to genocide prevention. Mass violence and genocide are difficult to examine because they present a very complex set of situations and at first glance seem unfathomable. Seeing the massacre in Rwanda and reading about the atrocities from the Holocaust leaves individuals speechless because such acts seem completely irrational and evil. At first glance, this is a normal reaction. However, much like the example of placation mentioned above, there is much more to mass acts of violence like genocide. The only clear distinction between rational and irrational behavior exemplified by genocidal perpetrators is the point from which the mass violence begins. However, moving to understand genocide in terms of structural violence, the line of rationality begins to blur and become more and more complicated to pinpoint. When examining modern-day genocides, the blame is pointed to groups or individuals perpetrating these atrocities. There is little or no examination of the unequal structures in place that might be propagating the mass violence. An examination of this structure which has produced these perpetrators is by no means to take responsibility or excuse the perpetrating groups or individual. The purpose is to better understand genocide in order to find means and methods of prevention. That's really important, not taking accountability away. Acknowledging false generosity as a precondition of structural violence and then understanding this framework can easily identify the progression of violence which results in genocide. Lemkin states, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to dignify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming the destruction of essential foundations by the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. This definition directly relates to the definition of structural violence. Systemic structural violence results in genocide. Although the violent actions are direct and made by individuals, the coordinated plan Lemkin reference is typically part of the socio-political structure. Before direct violence occurs, a structurally violent system has progressively annihilated the group by denying the nationalist group's basic needs. As this denial progresses, direct violence grows and in the worst-case scenario results in genocide. Conversely, those national groups who are once oppressed by a structurally violent system may gain power and then in turn put a new system of violence in. In the case of Nazi Germany, the disenfranchised group, which was the Germans after World War I, became the enfranchised group, and as the group gained power and with violent actions, the socio-political system became structurally violent by systematically oppressing Jews and then ultimately resulting in mass direct violence and annihilation. So a cycle of structural violence and annihilation continuously repeats itself. So just to offer some concluding thoughts and to get up on my soapbox for just a second, what does this mean? Why are we doing this? The fact is we have to start addressing the framework of structural violence and conflict resolution because we don't do it at all. In 1969, Galtung published his article, Violence, Peace, and Research, which has introduced the definition of structural violence, and from that point, this concept has become a framework that is used by many social science disciplines, especially in peace and conflict studies. Structural violence has helped many scholars and practitioners understand direct violence and prevention methods. However, in the 40 years since Galtung's piece was published, structural violence scholars understand the framework, can categorize and exemplify structural violence. They have not begun to formulate theories or concepts which seek to understand the formulation and prevention of structural violence. As my colleagues have stated, they've given many case studies of this has been going on forever. And we addressed the direct violence, but we never addressed what's happening structurally. So we have to have a movement in the field to start addressing structural violence at the root, and then how to dismantle and deconstruct this type of violence. Direct violence stems from structural violence. So unless this type of violence is formally addressed, there will never be sustainable change or prevention. I think that you can't have one without the other. I think that cultural narratives fuel whatever structural violence is there in a relationship is interconnected. Because I think the culture is born about the structure and goes from there. Does that answer your question?